In London, under the twinkling lights of the Thames, Julian, a single dad, worked as a cleaner in a tall office building. He never dreamed that Elise, the wealthy boss of the company, would notice him. One night, very late, the offices were silent. You could hear the hum of fluorescent lights, the quiet roll of the cleaning trolley, and the tick-tock of a wall clock. Elise was still at her desk, surrounded by stacks of papers. Her computer screen glowed with unread emails and papers to sign. She stood up, walked to the big window on the 25th floor, and stretched. Outside, London was falling asleep. Streetlights blinked, and cars slowed down. But something caught her eye. On the small outdoor ledge, a figure stood near the railing, too close to the edge. Her heart raced. She ran to the emergency door, pushed it open, and felt the cold night air. Her voice shook with worry as she shouted to ask what they were doing there. The man turned slowly, surprised. He wore a work uniform, a cloth over his shoulder, and gloves tucked in his belt. It was Julian. He blinked and smiled shyly. He said simply that she was waiting for him. Elise stepped forward carefully. She asked who was waiting. Julian pointed to the street below. Under a street lamp's glow, a little girl in a pink coat hugged a worn, stuffed toy and waved. Next to her, an old lady, Mrs. Clara, sold hot chestnuts from her cart. The girl waved again, her face bright with a big smile. Elise stopped, shocked. Julian turned to the window, breathed on it, and drew a wobbly cat in the mist. He waved, and the girl below jumped with joy, clapping. He explained they did this every night. She waited, he drew. It was their game. Elise watched quietly. The girl's happiness warmed her heart. She whispered to herself that if her child had lived, they would be that age. Julian looked at her softly, saying nothing. A long silence fell, broken only by London's quiet and the misty window. Elise asked the girl's name. Julian smiled and said it was Margot, 5 years old. He added he couldn't afford childcare, and his sister lived far away. Kids weren't allowed in the offices, so Mrs. Clara looked after Margot while he cleaned. Elise spoke softly. She asked if he always worked nights. Julian said he took shifts that let him pick Margot up from school and be there for bedtime. This job paid for food. Before he painted. But dreams didn't always pay bills. Elise looked at him closely. His hands were rough, his eyes tired but kind. She noticed he drew with mist. He said, a bit shy, that Margot thought it was magic. Maybe it was. A cool breeze blew between them. Elise introduced herself. Julian said he knew she was the boss. She raised an eyebrow and asked who he was. He said he was just a cleaner, with no bitterness, like it was obvious. Another silence came, but for the first time in ages, Elise didn't feel alone. Julian didn't feel invisible either. On the window, the cat drawing faded slowly, but it stayed there, imperfect and special. Elise looked at Margot below, still waving at the sky, like she expected a story. She whispered that Margot was lucky to have her dad. Julian didn't reply, but his kind eyes said everything. The next morning, in the busy building lobby, Elise stepped out of the lift, coffee in hand, already swamped with work. Her assistant talked fast, but Elise stopped suddenly. Near the reception, Julian was chatting with a security guard, holding a clipboard, dressed in his blue uniform. He adjusted the strap of a small backpack. Their eyes met. Julian gave a polite nod, expecting nothing more. To his surprise, Elise gave a small, real smile. It was the first time a manager noticed him without telling him to mind his mop. That evening, Elise stayed late again. The offices emptied and quiet settled in. She heard the soft sound of Julian's trolley wheels, then a faint tap. He was cleaning windows at the end of the hallway. Elise opened her door and asked if he always drew, or if it was just last night. Julian jumped, then smiled. He said it started with smiley faces. But now Margot wanted stars. Lots of stars. Elise walked closer, holding a folder. She asked if Margot knew he was an artist before. He said she thought he painted stars. She asked if that was true. He laughed quietly and said he tried. Elise leaned against the wall near him. She said he didn't talk like a cleaner. He admitted he hadn't always been one. There was a pause. Elise urged him to share. Julian hesitated, then sighed. Before Margot, he made pictures for children's books. He drew tales of rabbits in space or dragons made of clouds. His wife, Louise, loved it. They spent weekends drawing in parks, dreaming of their own art studio. Elise listened still. Julian's voice grew quieter. Louise died in a car crash. He was at home with Margot making pancakes. A phone call changed everything. He tried to keep drawing, but raising a little girl alone made it impossible. Money ran out. Dreams didn't feed them. Elise's throat tightened. Julian pulled a worn notebook from his bag and handed it to her. She opened it. The pages burst with color. Crayon skies, dancing trees, friendly monsters, kids laughing under stars. Some drawings were unfinished, others scribbled by a child's hand. Every page felt warm and loving. Elise whispered it was magical. Julian said softly it was his world before, now just memories. She asked why he stopped. He said dreams didn't buy food, but maybe they bought smiles. Elise closed the notebook gently. She said Margot was lucky. Julian said he was the lucky one. They stayed quiet, but the silence was comforting. Elise admitted people thought she was harsh, never smiling. Julian asked if it was true. She said she smiled more before, when she believed in kind things. Julian nodded, not pushing. Elise walked away, then turned back. She asked if he still had the drawing of a girl on the moon holding a star. His eyes widened. He said it was Louise's favorite. Elise smiled and said it was hers too. She asked to see it someday. She walked off, her heels echoing, but her steps felt lighter than they had in months. Another night, Elise was bent over her computer, numbers flashing on the screen, her eyes tired. The financial report was dull, lifeless. She sipped cold coffee and rubbed her temples. An hour passed, and she felt stuck. She stood and looked out the window. London kept shining, uncaring. Then she heard a soft sound. Julian was outside, cleaning windows carefully. He stopped, breathed on the glass, and drew in the mist. A little house, a smile, a heart. Elise watched, still. Julian saw her through the window, jumped, then waved slightly. She opened the door slowly and called him in for a break. He hesitated, cloth in hand. He said he wasn't sure he was allowed. She said he was. He sat carefully on a chair, gloves on his knees. Elise poured 2 cups of tea, her evening habit, and gave him one. He took it, surprised, and thanked her. After a few sips, Elise spoke. She asked why he drew those shapes. Julian said Margot loved guessing what they were. It calmed her, knowing he was up there, watching over her. Elise nodded, then looked at him. She asked what he thought of her. He looked surprised. She pressed, saying he'd heard the rumors, the nicknames. He paused. People said she was cold, distant, heartless. Elise sighed deeply. She said they weren't entirely wrong. She wasn't always like that. Her voice shook. She set down her cup and looked at London's lights. She shared that she lost a baby 5 years ago, a boy. Only 2 months were left before she could hold him. Then he was gone. Julian stayed quiet, his eyes gentle. Elise went on. Her fiancé, Victor, couldn't cope. He said she'd changed, was too sad. He left 3 weeks later. Doctors said she might not have more children. She didn't try. She buried herself in work, meetings, goals. She became what people said. She laughed sadly and said she still bought tea for 2. Julian put his hand on hers, gently. It was warm, comforting. He said people didn't see everything. He saw her strength, her kindness. She hid behind papers, but he saw someone looking out the window, hoping to feel again. Elise's eyes teared up. She squeezed his hand back. She whispered he wasn't what they said either. He smiled and said he'd painted stars once. They laughed softly, their tears easing old hurts. That night, nothing was fixed, but something shifted. 2 broken people found comfort in each other. Not love yet, but the start of healing. The next evening, Elise left her office as Julian finished cleaning the hallway windows. She carried a small paper bag and approached in flat shoes, quieter than usual. She called his name softly. He turned, surprised. She handed him the bag. He asked what it was. She said it was a gift for Margot. He opened it and found a pair of pink shoes with white daisies. He asked, moved, if she'd bought her shoes. Elise said she saw Margot's were worn out. She ran a lot. She needed strong ones. Julianne hugged the shoes close. He said she didn't have to. She said she wanted to. He looked at her, touched. He said Margot would love them, and thanked her. The next night, Julian came to Elise's office with a bag smelling of spices. She asked what it was, curious. He said she'd mentioned missing home-cooked food. He got it from a local vendor, something like his mum made. Elise tasted it and smiled. She said it was delicious. They ate together in her office, the window open, letting in a breeze. For the first time in ages, Elise felt present, grounded. Days later, she suggested a walk with Margot, nothing formal, just to meet her. Julian hesitated, then agreed. He said Margot would like it. That Friday, after his shift, they met outside. Margot ran to them, her new shoes flashing with each step. Elise knelt and said she must be Margot. Margot proudly said she was 5 3/4. They laughed, and Elise said that was the best age. They strolled through London streets, stopping at a stall for hot dogs and corn on the cob. Margot tugged Elise's hand, thrilled about candy floss. Julian sighed, laughing, and paid. Elise bit into her hot dog and laughed hearing Margot's story about a ninja cat. They sat on a cart, and Julian said she got that from her mum. They sat on a bench by a closed bookshop, the air warm around them. Margot fell asleep on her dad, who covered her with his jacket. Elise looked at him and said she was lucky. He whispered that some days he didn't feel good enough. She said being there was all that mattered. Julian smiled and said she laughed more now. Elise said she hadn't noticed she'd stopped. They sat quietly, watching cars pass. A new warmth grew between them, a feeling neither had dared hope for. Something like a family. Another night, Julian cleaned windows on the 22nd floor, but his movements were slow and clumsy. He dropped his broom and muttered a curse. It wasn't the job weighing him down, but something heavy worry. Elise, working on numbers, saw his tired face. She leaned against her door and asked calmly what was wrong. He hesitated. He said Margot had a fever. He couldn't miss work. He'd left her with Mrs. for him, Clara. She'd call if it got worse. Elise frowned, alarmed. She asked if he'd left a sick child with a vendor. He said, voice tight. He had no choice. He couldn't lose his job. Elise grabbed her keys and bag. She said they were going to get Margot now. In the lift, the air was heavy. Julian, eaten by guilt, stood stiff. Elise drove fast, hands tight on the wheel. They found Margot lying behind Mrs. Clara's cart, cheeks red, breathing weak. The old lady apologized, saying she was about to call. Elise picked up the child without pause. She whispered she was burning. She turned to Julian and told him to get in. At the hospital, Elise took charge, filling forms while Julian paced, fists clenched. Hours passed. They waited outside intensive care, bound by fear and something deeper. Julian whispered he should have stayed with her, his voice empty. Elise said he did what he could. How else would he pay rent or buy medicine? The doctor came and said Margot was stable, her fever dropping. They'd brought her in time. Julian sighed, breathing at last. Elise covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. Then, without thinking, she stood and hugged Julian. He stiffened, then hugged back. She whispered, Margot would be okay. In the dimly lit hospital room, Elise sat by Margot's bed. Julian stood by the window watching cars below. Silence hung heavy. Then Margot stirred, her tiny fingers twitching. She opened her eyes and whispered a word that startled Elise. Elise froze. Julian stepped forward to correct her, but Elise raised a shaky hand to stop him. She took Margot's hand and whispered to let her say it, just for now. Julian looked at her, seeing raw pain in her eyes for the first time. Elise said her son would have been 5 if he'd lived. She was 5 months pregnant. His name was Theo. Her fiancé, Victor, left when they learned he was gone. He said she wasn't the same. Julian sat beside her, silent. Elise went on. She hadn't cried for weeks. She threw herself into work, building a company to fill the emptiness. But it was never enough. She held Margot's hand tightly. She said the child called her that, and it shouldn't mean so much, but it did. Julian looked at her with deep kindness. He said she was there when Margot needed someone. She protected her. That's what a mum does. Elise looked at him, eyes shining. She said she didn't want to just pass through Margot's life. She wanted to help her grow, be in her world, their world. Julian nodded, moved. He said Margot already loved her, and so did he. Elise laughed, tears mixing with joy. She said she never thought she'd love again. Julian said he hadn't planned to either, but she came in the night, in a storm. They sat there, hand in hand, watching Margot sleep. Something had changed. Not a perfect promise, but a promise to stay. The next day, they left the hospital together. Elise carried Margot, who whispered again against her shoulder. Elise kissed her forehead and promised to be there every day, as long as she needed. From then on, they weren't two lost souls. They were a family, born not of blood, but of love and choice. A year later, a small shop on a corner of Portobello Road had changed. Instead of an empty window, a big one shone, painted with stars and blue letters. Margot's Star Studio. Inside, children laughed, brushes danced, and walls overflowed with colorful drawings. Julian, who once cleaned windows, now taught kids to see the world through them. No one knew who paid for the studio. Papers mentioned an anonymous gift, but when Julian saw Elise at the door, Margot on her hip, he knew. She did it quietly, because that was her way. Elise had changed. Not in her smart suits or how she ran meetings, but in her softer eyes, her freer smiles. She often left work early to join Julian and Margot at the studio, swapping heels for trainers. Margot's adoption was finalized 6 months before. In a small courtroom, Elise and Julian sat side by side, hands shaking. Margot played with the judge's gavel, amazed. When the judge asked if Elise accepted legal care of Margot Rose, she said yes firmly. Tears fell before the gavel struck. For Margot's 6th birthday, the studio was decorated with paper lanterns and twinkling stars. There was cake, music, and laughter. Elise watched Margot open gifts, Julian beside her. Their eyes glowed with a light Elise thought she'd lost forever. When the guests left, Julian took Elise's hand and led her to a painting on the wall. A house under a starry sky, a small figure holding a child's hand. He said he'd waited for the right moment and pulled out a small box. Inside wasn't a ring, but a silver chain with a pendant engraved with M&M and a tiny charm. Elise recognized it, the one she'd left on her desk a year ago, a memory of her lost son. Julian said he found it the night they met. He didn't know what it meant then. Elise touched the pendant, a tear falling. She said it was all she had of him. Julian said now it could mean something else. He closed her fingers over the chain. He said Elise saved his life, gave Margot a future, brought back a dream he'd buried. She made them whole. Elise nodded and hugged him. Margot called, pointing to a relit candle on the cake. Elise laughed through tears. Julian held her close. They weren't a perfect family, but they were better. A family born from loss, kindness, and second chances. Above them, a sign painted by Margot read, "The heart heals where it's loved," and theirs had healed together.